A hush fell over the first-class cabin as an elegant elderly woman made her way down the aisle. The soft buzz of conversation and the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a subtle shift in energy, the kind that only arrives with someone extraordinary. Her name was Evelyn Moore. At nearly 70, Evelyn carried herself with the kind of grace that turned heads without asking for attention. Her deep brown skin seemed to glow under the cabin's muted lights, and her simple navy blue dress, falling just below her knees, spoke more of timeless class than any luxury brand ever could. Her silver hair was swept back into a tidy bun, not a strand out of place. She held a small, worn leather handbag in one hand and a neatly folded boarding pass in the other. She walked with quiet confidence, each step deliberate, unaffected by the subtle glances of those seated around her. Some passengers looked on with polite curiosity. Others held expressions edged with quiet judgment, wondering how or why someone like her had found herself in the first-class cabin. Evelyn didn't notice, or maybe she just didn't care. When she reached her seat, a plush aisle seat in the front row, she offered a warm smile to the man beside her and gently placed her handbag in the overhead compartment. With practiced ease, she settled into her seat, smoothed the hem of her dress, and removed a small notebook from her bag. She flipped it open with the care of someone revisiting an old friend and began to write, her pen gliding smoothly across the pages. She didn't want attention. She wanted peace, but peace wasn't going to come. From the front of the cabin, Cara Phillips, a senior flight attendant, stepped into view. Her uniform was crisp, her posture stiff, her expression trained and professional. She scanned the cabin with the practiced gaze of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But when her eyes landed on Evelyn, she paused. Something about the woman didn't sit right with Cara. She had worked flights out of Bradley International for over a decade. She knew the usual crowd that populated first class: business professionals, celebrities, high-net-worth passengers dressed in sleek suits and designer shoes. Evelyn didn't match the mold. Her calm demeanor, her understated elegance, it made her seem out of place. Cara took a step forward, her brows knitting slightly. She stopped by Evelyn's seat, her presence sudden and unwelcome. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice polite but laced with a quiet suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass?" Evelyn looked up from her notebook. A flicker of surprise danced in her eyes, but her smile didn't falter. She nodded, reaching into her lap and handing over the paper without hesitation. "Of course," she said, her voice soft and even. Cara scanned the ticket, her eyes darting between the information and the woman before her. "This is for first class?" she asked, her tone sharper now, almost incredulous. Evelyn gave a calm nod. "Yes." It was confirmed weeks ago. There was nothing defensive in her reply. Oh, no anger, no sarcasm, just truth. Cara's eyes narrowed slightly. She hesitated before handing the ticket back, her jaw tightening as she did so. "Thank you," she said curtly, then turned and walked away. But her steps were slower now. Her mind wasn't at ease. Every few minutes, her gaze drifted back toward Evelyn, as though she were waiting for a mistake to reveal itself. Evelyn, meanwhile, had already returned to her notebook, jotting her thoughts as though the moment hadn't happened at all. But others had noticed. The tension was subtle, but it began to ripple through the cabin like a current. A few whispers floated between seats. A glance here, a side-eye there. No one dared speak up, but everyone felt it. Cara, though, couldn't let it go. Something about Evelyn's presence unnerved her, not because of anything the woman had done, but because of the way she held herself. That silent poise, that unwavering dignity. It challenged Cara's assumptions, poked at her instincts. And the more she watched, the more uncomfortable she became. As Evelyn wrote, her pen never once faltering, Cara found herself glancing over again and again. It didn't make sense. The boarding pass checked out, but her gut told her otherwise. She didn't belong here. At least that's what Cara told herself. After another round through the cabin, Cara made up her mind. She walked swiftly toward Evelyn's seat again, her steps no longer hesitant. "Ms. Moore," she began, her voice firmer than before, "there appears to be a seating error. I'll need you to step aside while we sort it out." Evelyn looked up, her pen pausing mid-word. "A seating error?" she echoed gently. Cara nodded. "Yes. It seems you may have been mistakenly assigned to this section." Evelyn closed her notebook slowly, her fingers calm and deliberate. I don't believe that's the case," she replied. "This seat was assigned to me. I confirmed it with the airline last week." Cara's tone sharpened. "I've already looked into it. I think we need to move you to the main cabin." The silence that followed felt like a crack in the atmosphere. Evelyn said nothing at first. Her expression didn't change. If anything, it grew stiller, like the eye of a brewing storm. And then, without resistance, she rose from her seat. She moved slowly, but there was strength in every step, the kind of strength born from experience, from knowing exactly who you are. She reached for her bag, carefully tucking the notebook back inside. Cara gestured toward the back, her tone clipped. "This way, please." The eyes of the other passengers followed as Evelyn passed by. Some watched with discomfort. Others turned away. But no one said a word. She didn't need their sympathy. She didn't ask for their approval. She walked with dignity, the kind that didn't require a seat to prove it. But as she took her place in a cramped middle seat, far from the luxury she had rightfully earned, something shifted. Not in Evelyn, in Cara. A doubt, a whisper, a question she couldn't ignore. And what neither of them knew was that a call was already being made, one that would change everything. "There seems to be an issue with your seating assignment," Cara said firmly, standing tall beside Evelyn Moore's seat. Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked up from her notebook with the faintest smile, one so subtle it was almost unreadable. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice calm and composed, as if genuinely curious rather than offended. Cara nodded, her tone tightening. "Yes." "I believe there's been an error. You've been seated in first class by mistake. I'll need you to relocate to the main cabin." For the first time, Evelyn's expression shifted, but only slightly. A flicker of confusion passed over her face, then disappeared as quickly as it came. "I don't believe that's necessary," she replied evenly. "My seat was confirmed in advance. There must be a misunderstanding." Cara crossed her arms. Her voice dropped almost to a murmur, not quite meant to be heard, but not hidden either. "I've double-checked, and honestly, I don't think this seat is a good fit for you. The implication was clear and heavy." For a moment, Evelyn was silent. She could feel the weight of what wasn't being said, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. But she didn't let it touch her expression. Without a word, she stood, gracefully, deliberately. She moved like someone who'd learned long ago that pride didn't need to be loud, that dignity, when held correctly, could disarm even the cruelest insult. She gathered her belongings, her worn handbag, her notebook, and turned to face Cara, who gestured toward the back of the plane with a sense of triumph masked as professionalism. "I'll show you to your new seat," Cara said. Her tone, though polite, carried a finality that suggested there would be no further discussion. Evelyn began her walk down the aisle. Passengers turned their heads, some with confused glances, others with sympathetic eyes. Many looked away, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. The whispers started, faint and scattered, as if no one wanted to be the first to name what was unfolding. But Evelyn? She walked with poise, the same steady poise she'd had when she first boarded the plane. Behind her, Cara followed, her steps a little too confident, as if she had restored order, reaffirmed a system she believed had been momentarily breached. When they reached the main cabin, Cara pointed to a narrow middle seat nestled between two strangers. "Please take a seat here," she said with a firmness that masked satisfaction. Evelyn said nothing. She placed her bag gently beneath the seat in front of her and eased herself down. Not a single gesture wasted, not a single word offered in protest. She adjusted the creases in her dress, clasped her hands in her lap, and turned toward the window. As Cara walked away, she felt a knot beginning to form in her stomach. A sensation she didn't want to admit was guilt. There was something unsettling about how untouched Evelyn seemed, how serene she looked even now. It didn't make sense, but Cara forced herself to focus. The disruption was over, she told herself. The mistake had been corrected. Order in her mind had been restored. Back in first class, she moved through the aisle offering drinks, greeting passengers, putting on her most professional smile. But the image of Evelyn sitting quietly in that cramped row behind her kept resurfacing in her mind like a shadow that wouldn't lift. She looked back, just for a second, and there she was, Evelyn Moore, sitting still, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. She was scrolling through her phone now, her fingers tapping quickly across the screen. Once in a while, she looked out the window, her expression calm. Too calm. It didn't fit. It didn't make sense to Cara that someone who'd just been removed from first class could carry herself like that. And yet, she did. Cara's nerves buzzed quietly beneath her smile as she poured wine and passed snacks. Something didn't add up. As the flight settled into cruise, the tension in the air never quite dissolved. It lingered, soft but persistent, like static electricity that had nowhere to go. And then came Leah Chen. Leah was one of the younger attendants, assigned to economy, where Evelyn now sat. She had watched the earlier exchange from a distance, her face quietly registering what others had ignored. She had seen the grace with which Evelyn had walked, and the pride with which she had been dismissed. As she made her rounds through the cabin, Leah approached Evelyn's row. With a soft voice and kind eyes, she gently extended a small plastic cup filled with water. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked quietly. Evelyn turned to her and offered the same smile she had given to the stranger beside her earlier, gentle, warm, but distant. "I'm fine, thank you," she said in a low voice, one lined with maturity and control. "Just a small mix-up with my seat." Leah lingered for a second, unsure whether to say more. She could tell Evelyn wasn't sharing everything, but she also knew enough to respect her silence. So instead, she nodded. "If you need anything," she said softly, "I'm just a few steps away." As Leah walked away, Evelyn looked out the window again, her phone now tucked back into her handbag. She had sent the message she needed to send. There was nothing more to do now but wait. And somewhere far below the clouds, that message had already been received by someone whose power would soon shake the foundation of the very airline Evelyn had just been humiliated in. The game hadn't even begun yet. Leah hesitated, her hand still hovering slightly above the tray table. She could sense it. There was more beneath Evelyn Moore's calm surface than she was letting on. But she didn't press. Instead, she placed the cup of water down gently and offered a small, respectful nod. "If you need anything at all," she said softly, "just let me know." Evelyn gave her a warm, appreciative smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice smooth and controlled. "It's just a minor mix-up. Nothing more." Leah lingered for only a second before stepping away, her heart still heavy with concern. As the younger attendant moved down the aisle, Evelyn turned back toward the window. She retrieved her phone from her bag and began typing swiftly, her fingers moving with quiet purpose. The message was brief and powerful. Once sent, she slipped the device back into her bag, her eyes never leaving the soft stretch of sky outside. But her thoughts They were nowhere near the clouds. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Her poise was not just instinct, it was preparation. She knew exactly what she was doing. Back in the forward cabin, Cara Phillips moved through her duties with a mechanical rhythm. She poured drinks, smiled when required, and passed out napkins with the kind of practiced grace that came from years of service. But her mind wasn't in it. It was somewhere else entirely. It kept drifting back to Evelyn Moore, her calmness, her self-control, her complete lack of reaction. It was unnerving. Cara had expected tension, maybe even confrontation. What she got instead was silence. Peaceful, disarming silence. And that scared her more than anything. What kind of person remained so composed after being publicly humiliated, after being removed from a first-class seat they had rightfully paid for? What kind of woman doesn't even flinch? Cara felt the flicker of doubt begin to grow in her chest, a whisper that maybe she had crossed a line, that maybe she had judged too quickly, acted too harshly, but she shoved the thought down. She had done her job. She was following protocol, right? Still, the unease lingered like a cold draft in a sealed cabin. Evelyn's presence, even several rows behind her, still felt close. Too close. It was as though she could feel the older woman's gaze, even though Evelyn hadn't looked at her since being moved. Time moved forward, but for Cara, the world seemed to slow. The cabin settled into its usual rhythm. Passengers chatted softly, sipped their drinks, flipped through magazines and movies. But for Cara, everything felt off, like the balance had shifted and no one else had noticed. She kept glancing back, and every time she did, Evelyn was the same, still, quiet, dignified, not angry, not upset, not even bothered. It was unnerving. Cara had never seen someone react to injustice with such quiet power. The woman hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a scene, hadn't demanded anything, but somehow that made it worse. Cara moved through the aisles faster now, as though she could outrun her thoughts, but the faster she moved, the louder the doubt became. In the galley, she fumbled with the coffee cups, her hands slightly shaky. The mess of plastic lids and clattering metal only mirrored the growing mess in her mind. What had she done? It wasn't just about seating anymore. It wasn't about first class or economy or any airline policy. It was about how she had treated someone, how she had dismissed someone, not because of her ticket, but because of who she thought she was. Cara's heart pounded as she tried to keep moving, but the sinking feeling wouldn't leave. Something was coming. She could feel it, and she wasn't ready. Her walkie-talkie crackled to life, the sound making her jump slightly. She grabbed it quickly, eager for any distraction. "Cara," a voice said, low, calm, but carrying weight. "The captain would like to speak with you, right away." Her breath hitched. The captain? Why? The only reason he'd call her mid-flight was if something serious had happened. And deep down, Cara already knew what it was about. She tightened her grip on the walkie-talkie and turned toward the front of the aircraft, her hands trembling slightly. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thicker. Every step she took toward the galley felt heavier, as though the plane itself had turned against her. She passed by passengers without really seeing them, her mind racing. This wasn't about a seat anymore. This was bigger, far bigger than she had prepared for. Something had been set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The air felt heavier the closer Cara Phillips got to the flight deck. Her footsteps slowed as an uneasy chill slid down her spine, a warning that whatever waited for her behind that door wasn't just routine. Each step thudded louder than the last, echoing in her ears like the beat of a drum. Her pulse raced, her thoughts spun. This is about Evelyn, she thought. It had to be. When she stepped into the galley just outside the cockpit, Samuel Reed was waiting for her. The senior flight attendant had been with Sky Atlantic for over 20 years. A quiet man with watchful eyes and a memory like a ledger. He didn't say a word right away. He just looked at her, A long, unreadable glance. There was no smile, no nod of comfort, just a stillness that made her even more uneasy. "What's going on?" Cara asked, trying to sound confident, but her voice betrayed her. Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a folded slip of paper. His hand was steady, his face unreadable. "The captain wants to see you," he said finally. His voice was low and even, but there was something behind it. A weight, a warning. Cara's heart sank. She opened the note. "Cara, report to the cockpit immediately." That was it. No explanation, no softening, no way out. Her throat tightened as she turned toward the cockpit. Her nerves were lit like wires, crackling with dread. She passed a few passengers who barely looked up, but their soft whispers pricked her skin like static. Everyone could feel it. Something was wrong. When she reached the cockpit door, she paused. Just for a second. Then she knocked. The door opened, and Captain Logan Hart, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and the quiet authority of someone used to pressure, motioned her inside. The co-pilot was focused on the flight instruments, but the captain's eyes never left her. "Have a seat," he said, his voice firm but not cruel. Cara sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her breathing was shallow, her thoughts racing. The captain leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We've received a troubling report," he began, "about an incident in the first-class cabin." Cara didn't move. "You removed a passenger, a woman named Evelyn Moore, from her assigned seat and relocated her to economy. Is that correct?" Cara's throat went dry. She tried to speak, but the captain lifted his hand. "I understand you thought you were following protocol," he continued, his voice calm but layered with disapproval. "But this goes beyond that." He took a breath before delivering the blow. "Ms. Moore isn't just any passenger. Her husband, Charles Moore, is one of the airline's major shareholders. He's already contacted the board." Cara's heart nearly stopped. She felt the blood drain from her face. Everything inside her froze. She had no idea who Evelyn really was. She had looked at her and seen... what? An older woman in a simple dress? Someone who didn't look like a first-class traveler? She had been wrong. So wrong. And now the consequences were barreling toward her faster than the aircraft they were in. "The executive office is already involved," Captain Hart said, his tone shifting from firm to grim. "They've requested a full report the moment we land. They're not happy." Cara sat frozen. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't recognize her. She didn't seem like..." She stopped herself. The words were poison, and she knew it. "I just thought she didn't seem like someone who usually sits in first class. I was just trying to do my job." Captain Hart stared at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change. "You should have checked. Twice," he said quietly. "We don't make decisions based on appearances. Not here, not in the air. You didn't just move a passenger. You humiliated someone connected to the very people who sign our paychecks." He leaned forward now, the air in the cockpit growing colder. "This could affect all of us, Cara, not just you." She felt the words hit like a punch. The weight of her assumptions, her actions, now loomed over her like a storm cloud. "From here on out," he continued, "don't make another mistake. Do your job. Stay professional. And unless it's absolutely necessary, don't speak to Mrs. Moore again." Cara nodded slowly, her throat tight. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The captain turned back to the controls, his message clear. The conversation was over. But the fallout was only just beginning. As Cara stepped out of the cockpit, the cabin felt different, heavier, darker. The air seemed charged, and every face she passed felt like a mirror reflecting her mistake. She moved through the aisle like a ghost, her confidence shattered. Her thoughts, once steady and sharp, were now a swirling mess of guilt and fear. As she approached the main cabin, her eyes landed on Evelyn Moore once again. There she was, sitting quietly, hands folded, her gaze out the window, serene, silent, still, as if none of it had ever touched her, as if she knew something Cara didn't. The whispers had begun now. Passengers leaned toward one another, murmuring under their breath. Some glanced at Evelyn with curiosity, others with quiet sympathy. And when their eyes drifted to Cara, she felt the weight of their judgment. She had made a mistake, a terrible one. But worse than that, she had done it loudly, in full view of the people she was meant to serve. And now, every step she took felt like a step toward the unknown. Because one thing was certain, nothing about this flight would be the same after they landed. Passengers whispered behind polite hands. Some were curious, others quietly concerned, but no one dared speak the truth out loud. They were all wondering the same thing. Who was this woman? And why had she been moved to the back of the plane? As Cara Phillips walked down the aisle, her steps faltered ever so slightly. Her eyes landed once again on Evelyn Moore, still seated in the cramped middle row. There was no trace of anger on Evelyn's face, no bitterness, no indignation. She looked almost serene. Cara's stomach churned. This wasn't the reaction she had expected, or maybe in some buried part of her, feared. Evelyn wasn't just calm, she was unreadable, powerful in her silence. Her expression, composed and unbothered, stood in stark contrast to the storm that now raged in Cara's own chest. I was wrong about her. The thought struck like a blade. The flight, which had once seemed routine, was now spinning out of control. And Cara was right at the center of the chaos. She continued serving drinks, her movements robotic, her smile paper-thin. Every step, every passenger interaction felt like a performance she could barely keep up. Each time her eyes drifted toward Evelyn, the older woman's stillness mocked her unraveling nerves. Evelyn had become a mirror, reflecting Cara's worst misjudgment, and she hated that she couldn't look away. But the most unsettling part? It felt like Evelyn knew, not just about the mistake, but about everything. Cara wasn't just embarrassed. She was exposed. Around her, the other flight attendants kept their distance. Samuel Reed, the seasoned attendant who had passed her the captain's note, now looked at her with a mixture of quiet concern and unspoken disappointment. His usual calm felt heavier, colder. Leah Chen, graceful and gentle, went about her duties in economy with soft poise. But there was something different in the way she looked at Cara now. Not cruel, but cautious, reserved, as if Cara had done something unforgivable, but no one quite knew how to say it aloud. The silence between crew members wasn't tension anymore, it was judgment. It pressed in on Cara from all sides, quiet, suffocating, relentless. She tried to tell herself it would blow over, that it would all pass once they landed, but deep down she knew better. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Suddenly the overhead intercom buzzed to life, jolting Cara from her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of Captain Logan Hart, steady and reassuring. "We'd like to thank you for flying with Sky Atlantic today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let a crew member know." The message was routine, but for Cara it felt like a slow toll of warning bells. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Then, without meaning to, she looked back toward Evelyn's seat again. And this time, Evelyn was looking back. Their eyes met, just for a moment. There was no hatred in Evelyn's gaze, no fury, no scorn, only a quiet understanding, a calm acknowledgement, the kind that said, "I see what you did, I see who you are, and I don't need to raise my voice to change everything." Cara's chest tightened. As she walked past Evelyn once more, the woman gave her a soft, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't smug, it wasn't cruel. But it pierced deeper than any scream could have. It said more than words ever could. Cara looked away, breath catching in her throat. This, whatever this was, wasn't over. And she knew it. The tension continued to build as the flight moved forward. It wasn't just in Cara's mind now. It buzzed faintly through the cabin, like static beneath the pleasant hum of the engines. Conversations were shorter. Passengers seemed more alert, their eyes flicking back and forth between Evelyn and the flight crew. Everyone could feel it. And every time Cara passed Evelyn, she was reminded again of the mistake she had made and the power Evelyn still held. Because the truth was, Evelyn had never lost control. Cara had. She kept busy, trying to distract herself, but her focus splintered with every tray she handed out, every forced smile, every side glance. People were watching, judging. The judgment wasn't always loud, but it was there, lingering like a shadow. She saw it in the way passengers' gazes followed her. She felt it in the uncomfortable hush that followed her down the aisle. But the worst part? She deserved it. She had looked at Evelyn and made a decision based on nothing but assumptions about who she thought deserved first-class treatment, about who looked like they belonged. And now? Now Evelyn sat back in her seat, phone in hand, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. A small smile curved her lips, not smug, not triumphant, just knowing. Cara's heart skipped. She's not just waiting, she's planning, and whatever Evelyn Moore was about to do. Cara knew she wasn't ready for it. There it was again, that faint, almost imperceptible smile on Evelyn Moore's face. It wasn't smug or spiteful, it was quiet, subtle, but impossible to miss. And it shook Cara Phillips to her core. She couldn't stop herself from wondering, was Evelyn smiling because she knew exactly how much power she held? Because she had let Cara walk into her own mistake? Or was it something else? Something Cara couldn't yet see. Her hands trembled as she passed a drink to a passenger. She tried to maintain her composure, her professional smile still painted on. But inside, she was unraveling. Fast. The damage had already been done. And Cara knew, without a shadow of doubt, there was no way to undo it. What she had done to Evelyn, the humiliation, the dismissal, the disrespect, it wasn't just wrong. It was a disaster. And she was starting to realize just how far the consequences might reach. Then her walkie-talkie crackled to life, a sharp burst of static, followed by a voice. "Cara, please come to the galley immediately." The voice was unfamiliar, clipped and professional. Not one of the crew, someone from the cockpit. Her heart skipped, panic rising. What now? She moved quickly, though every step felt heavier than the last. Her chest tightened as she reached the galley where Samuel Reed was already waiting. He stood with his arms folded, expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. The weight in the room spoke volumes. Finally, he looked her in the eye. "The captain just got a call," he said slowly. "From corporate." Cara froze. What did they say? Samuel handed her another note. His face was tight with concern, but also something colder. "The executive office is asking for a written report," he said. "They want to know exactly why you moved Mrs. Moore out of first class." Cara felt her chest collapse in on itself. The words hit her like a slap. She clutched the note, her knuckles white. This wasn't just an awkward moment anymore. This was real, serious. The airline was watching too closely. And Evelyn Moore. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the wife of one of the most powerful men behind Sky Atlantic's walls. "You don't understand," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "Her husband owns part of this airline. You didn't just insult someone with status. You humiliated a shareholder's wife in front of a full flight." Cara's mouth went dry, her stomach twisted with dread. She had made a split-second decision based on appearance, on bias, and now it was spiraling beyond her control. Samuel didn't sugarcoat it. "I hope you're ready for what's coming," he said, his voice firm but not cruel. "Because this is going to land hard, and there's no soft way out of it." Cara's legs felt unsteady beneath her. Her mind raced in every direction. The error, what she had dismissed as a policy check, had become a career-altering catastrophe. She had assumed. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't looked twice. And now she had offended someone who could end her career with a single conversation. Samuel continued, watching her closely. "You didn't know who she was," he said, "but you do now. And no, this isn't going to just blow over. If Mr. Moore decides to act, there's very little anyone can do to stop him." Cara felt her lips part, her voice barely a whisper. What should I do?" She swallowed hard. Should I go talk to her? Apologize? What if she goes to the press? What if I lose my job? Samuel's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I don't know what's coming," he admitted, "but I do know this. It's out of our hands now. All you can do is finish this flight, write your report, and pray it doesn't go public." Cara nodded numbly. Her body moved, but her mind was still spinning. A single assumption, a few words, a forced relocation. It was all it took. Now she was trapped in a moment she couldn't take back. A mistake that had begun as quiet bias, but had become a symbol of something far greater. She stepped out of the galley, the note still clenched in her hand, and glanced toward the main cabin. There was Evelyn. Her eyes were closed now, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breathing slow. Calm. She looked as if nothing had happened. But Cara knew better. Evelyn wasn't ignoring what had occurred. She was waiting, and that, more than anything, terrified Cara. She couldn't meet the woman's gaze, not anymore. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was profound. It was heavier than words. It was justice, waiting to speak. Back in the galley, Cara stared at the metal counter, her breath shallow. Her walkie-talkie buzzed again, softer this time. She didn't want to answer it. She already knew what it meant, but she had no choice. With trembling fingers, she lifted it to her mouth. "This is Cara," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "Cara, this is the captain," came the voice through the static-laced walkie-talkie. It was steady, direct. "We need to talk. Meet me in the cockpit." Her hands shook as she set the device down. She already knew what this was about, what it had to be about, and she also knew this wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. It wasn't going to be a chance to explain herself. This was the beginning of the end, or at least the end of the version of her life she thought was safe. Cara's legs felt unsteady as she made her way forward. Each step toward the cockpit was heavier than the last, the tension in her chest growing tighter. The aisles, the faces, the soft chatter, it all blurred into static. Everything felt heavier, thicker, more suffocating. It was like the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see how this would all unfold. She reached the cockpit door and paused, her hand hovering just long enough to register the tremble in her fingers. Then she knocked. A pause, then Captain Logan Hart's voice. "Come in." She stepped inside. The cockpit was quiet. Too quiet. The co-pilot focused on the instruments, but the captain was watching her. His expression was carved from stone. "Have a seat, Cara," he said, gesturing to the fold-down chair across from him. She obeyed, lowering herself slowly, her body tight with tension. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. The hum of the instruments filled the space. Then finally, he spoke. "We've received a direct complaint from Mrs. Moore," Captain Hart said, his voice low and calm, but not kind. "And yes, before you ask, her husband owns a controlling stake in this airline." Cara felt her chest cave in. She had expected backlash, but not this, not corporate, not the board, not him. Captain Hart leaned forward slightly, his voice sharper now. "We've been contacted directly by the executive office. They've instructed me to handle this with full accountability. That includes you." Cara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her thoughts were racing too fast for speech. I didn't know who she was," she finally managed, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was just doing my job. I didn't mean for it to become—" The captain raised a hand, silencing her. "Intent doesn't matter anymore," he said. "You misjudged her. You made a decision rooted in assumption, and now we're staring down a potential PR nightmare." His eyes didn't blink. "She's already contacted legal. There will be no quiet resolution to this." Cara felt the world tilt around her. The cockpit, once familiar, now felt like a pressure chamber. Mrs. Moore's smile flashed in her mind, that unshaken calm, that quiet strength. She had known. Somehow she had known. "She's not just upset," the captain continued. "She's setting a precedent, one that could damage more than your reputation. It could touch the whole brand." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose before delivering the next blow. "When we land, you'll submit a full incident report to the executive team. Detail everything, your reasoning, your decisions, and how you plan to prevent this from happening again. Do you understand?" Cara could barely nod. Her throat was too tight to speak. He stood, returning his focus to the flight controls, but his final words stayed with her. "You've got a lot to answer for. Keep your head down, and whatever you do, don't make it worse." She turned to leave, her mind spinning, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Before she reached the door, the captain spoke again. "One more thing," he said, his tone softer, but heavy with warning. "This isn't just about your job anymore. The reputation of this airline is on the line. Don't make it any harder on yourself than it already is." Cara nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. As she stepped out of the cockpit, the door clicked shut behind her, and she was plunged back into the eerie silence of the main cabin. She didn't recognize the world around her anymore. The people, the sounds, the flight, it all blurred like a dream that had just become a nightmare. She walked down the aisle on autopilot, the faces of the passengers melting into indistinct smudges. Her chest was tight, her limbs heavy, every breath hurt. And then she passed Evelyn Moore. The older woman sat with the same grace as always, her posture perfect, her gaze calm and focused on the sky outside. There was no hint of anger, no visible emotion at all, just stillness. And yet Cara felt it, felt the weight of being seen, not as a flight attendant, not even as a person, but as someone who had made a devastating mistake and now had to live with it. It was almost unbearable. She quickened her pace, desperate to escape the invisible thread that tethered them together. But nothing could sever it now. Whatever came next, Evelyn Moore held the strings, and Cara could only brace for the pull. The fallout had already begun, and Cara Phillips could feel it. In the glances, the whispers, the way passengers subtly shifted in their seats when she passed. It was like the cabin air had thickened, heavy with the tension that came from knowing something serious had happened, and that the person responsible was still walking the aisles. She tried to focus, grabbing the drink cart from the back of the plane, but her hands trembled as she poured coffee into plastic cups. Her gaze flitted nervously from seat to seat. Conversations hushed when she approached. Passengers looked at her, then quickly looked away. The judgment wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. They knew, or at least they suspected, and Cara's face burned with the weight of their questions, the ones they didn't dare speak aloud. What did she do? Why was that woman moved? Who was she really? Cara didn't have answers, only dread. Just as she began pushing the cart down the aisle, her walkie-talkie buzzed again, this time more urgently. "Cara," came the voice. Crisp, tense. "The captain needs you, right now." Her heart dropped. Again? She had already been summoned once, already received the warning. What now? The voice in her head screamed that this was getting worse, that the damage was far deeper than she had first imagined. She left the cart behind and moved quickly toward the galley. Samuel Reed was waiting for her again. This time his face wasn't unreadable. It was grave. "I think it's time to brace yourself," he said quietly. Cara froze. "What? What now?" "They're not letting this slide," Samuel said. "Not with the kind of connections she has." Cara swallowed. Her mouth felt dry as paper. Samuel handed her another folded slip of paper. "This one's from the executive office," he said. "Take it to Captain Hart. They're discussing next steps." She took the note with trembling hands. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of her entire future. She turned and walked toward the cockpit once more, her thoughts spiraling. Every step down the aisle felt like a countdown. 10, 9, 8. By the time she knocked on the cockpit door, she felt like she was walking into a sentencing. Captain Logan Hart looked up as she entered. His eyes met hers, still composed, but far more serious than before. "Sit," he said. Cara lowered herself into the seat across from him. Her fingers were cold against the paper she handed over. The captain opened the note. "Read it." Then looked back at her. "Evelyn Moore's husband has already spoken to the board," he said. The words hit Cara like a slap. "They want a full report from you. Immediately after landing, they expect answers, a detailed account, every step you took." He paused. "But let's be clear, Cara, this is no longer just a disciplinary matter." She couldn't breathe. Her chest rose and fell in shallow movements. "This isn't a small mistake," the captain continued. "This is big, the kind of situation that could damage the entire brand." Cara's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "I didn't know who she was. I thought I was enforcing policy. I never meant—" "I believe you," the captain said flatly, "but that's not going to matter." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You need to treat this like a crisis, because it is." Cara gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles pale. Everything inside her was unraveling. She had removed a woman from her first-class seat without asking the right questions. She had assumed, judged, acted, and now the ripple effect was turning into a tidal wave. Captain Hart sighed, rubbing his temples. "You need to handle this carefully," he said. "Don't speak to passengers. Don't say a word to Mrs. Moore. Just do your job, stay composed, and prepare your report." Cara nodded, but her body didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. It felt heavy, slow, faint. Then the captain added one final truth, and it sealed the gravity of it all. "I don't think you understand who you offended. Mrs. Moore isn't just the wife of a shareholder, she's a major shareholder herself. She holds voting power on the board." Cara's breath caught. "She's not someone you can afford to underestimate," he said, "and unfortunately that's exactly what you did. It was all too much." Cara sat frozen, her mind spinning with every warning, every consequence. Her entire career, everything she'd built over years of dedication, now hanging by a thread, not because she broke a rule, but because she made a decision without grace, without care, without empathy. And now that decision was echoing through every corridor of the airline's leadership. If this got out to the public, if the press found out what happened to a woman like Evelyn Moore, it wouldn't just be Cara's name at risk. It would be Sky Atlantic's. The captain's voice pulled her back. "Don't make it worse than it already is." Cara nodded, but her thoughts had already left the cockpit. They were back in the main cabin, where Evelyn Moore still sat, calm as ever, and somehow more powerful than anyone else on that plane. "Don't apologize right now." Captain Logan Hart's words echoed in Cara Phillips' mind like a drumbeat. "It won't fix anything," He had been right. Apologies wouldn't undo what she'd done. They wouldn't erase the humiliation, the assumptions, the insult. Not when the woman she had wronged held enough power to move boardroom mountains with a single phone call. "All you can do now is keep your head down, stay calm, and be ready to answer for it," he had said. "I'll be with you when we land. But you'll have to face the board yourself." There was no way around it. Cara had nodded, even though her legs felt like they might collapse beneath her. "I understand," she whispered. But she didn't. Not really. She only knew that everything had changed. The minutes that followed stretched endlessly. The plane moved forward through smooth skies, but Cara felt like she was caught in a slow-motion spiral. Every second that passed reminded her of the mistake. The moment she judged Evelyn Moore not by her boarding pass, but by her skin, her age, her quiet composure. Her own bias had spoken louder than her professionalism, and now the cost of that moment echoed through every inch of her. When she returned to the cabin, she glanced toward Evelyn's seat. The woman hadn't moved. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. She looked serene, peaceful even. But to Cara, it was terrifying. Because Evelyn's calm didn't feel like detachment, it felt like preparation, as if she had seen this storm coming long before it formed, as if she had been waiting for the exact moment it would land. Cara's stomach twisted. Evelyn hadn't raised her voice, hadn't called for attention, hadn't even looked particularly upset, and yet somehow she had become the most powerful presence in the entire cabin, the eye of a hurricane only Cara could feel pressing against her from all sides. The cabin filled with the soft clatter of seatbelts being fastened as the descent began. Passengers were moving slowly, more alert now. There was a buzz in the air, a kind of charged energy that hadn't been there before. It wasn't excitement, it was anticipation. Cara moved down the aisle, checking trays and overhead compartments, but her motions were robotic. Her thoughts were screaming beneath her calm surface. She tried to fake a smile for a passenger, but barely managed a weak curve of her lips. This wasn't turbulence from the air. This was fallout. As she passed by Samuel Reed, he avoided her gaze. His face was stiff, professional, but distant, a man protecting his own career now, not hers. Leah Chen offered her a faint glance. There was no judgment in it, just quiet sympathy. But even that stung. Cara didn't want to be pitied. She wanted to vanish. She passed Evelyn's seat one final time and froze. The older woman sat there as if she were on a leisurely train ride, not at the center of a scandal. Eyes still closed, breathing steady, untouched, unbothered, unbreakable. Cara felt like she was shrinking just standing next to her. Small, powerless. She had misjudged Evelyn so completely, so unforgivably, that she now couldn't even face the woman without feeling the weight of every poor decision she had made. How had she kept her poise through it all? How had she said nothing, and still said everything? As Cara moved back to the front of the plane, the intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hart's voice rang out, "we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seat belts are securely fastened and your tray tables are locked in the upright position." Cara moved quickly to carry out her final duties, checking the rows, adjusting headrests, giving rehearsed thank yous. But inside, she was spiraling. What was waiting for her on the ground? A report, a suspension, termination. Would the press get hold of it? Would Evelyn speak publicly? Would her career, her years of service, dedication, and discipline be reduced to a headline about discrimination on Flight 417? As the plane began its final approach, the landing gear deployed with a familiar rumble. Cara's heart pounded with every thud. The silence from the passengers was deafening. There were no excited murmurs about travel plans, no applause for a smooth descent. Just a stillness. A heavy collective breath being held, and Cara could feel every eye on her. Every glance said, "We saw it. We heard what happened. We know." She kept her head down, moving as quickly and quietly as she could, collecting cups, checking seatbacks, making herself small. But no matter how fast she moved, the whispers followed. They always did. No matter how many tasks Cara Phillips forced herself to complete, collecting discarded cups, resetting seatbacks, nothing could distract her from the tightening grip in her chest. With every step she felt it, her life shifting, unraveling. This flight was no longer just another assignment. It was the moment everything changed. When the aircraft finally came to a complete stop at the gate, the usual chaos began. Seat belts clicking, passengers standing, overhead bins opening. But there was no relief in the air, no cheerful chatter, no warm goodbyes. There was only tension. Cara's eyes flicked toward Evelyn Moore's seat one last time. The woman remained seated, calm and composed, until most passengers had already begun filing out. Then, with quiet precision, she stood. She moved down the aisle with the same grace she had entered with, elegant, unbothered, and fully in control. Cara stood motionless, watching her. And then, Evelyn looked at her, not with anger, not even disappointment, just a brief, knowing glance, one that pierced deeper than words could. It was the kind of look that didn't accuse. It simply revealed. Cara felt the weight of it immediately. Guilt surged through her, sharp and unforgiving. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Evelyn didn't pause. She turned away and stepped off the plane, never saying a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything Cara had ever heard, and in that moment, Cara knew the worst was still ahead. The passengers continued to exit one by one until only Cara remained. The other crew members had already gone, leaving her alone in the cabin. Alone with her thoughts, her mistake, her shame. The sounds of the airport, beeping carts, distant announcements, the shuffle of luggage, filtered in faintly from the jet bridge. But inside the aircraft, it was eerily quiet. She moved slowly to the overhead bin and retrieved her personal bag. Her fingers trembled as she zipped it shut. And then, footsteps. Her heart stopped. She turned toward the front door, and her breath caught in her throat. 2 uniformed airport security officers stood in the entryway. Their postures were stiff, their expressions unreadable. "Are you Cara Phillips?" one of them asked, his voice low and professional. Cara's throat tightened. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, barely able to speak. "We need you to come with us," the officer continued, his tone calm but absolute. "We have a few questions regarding an incident that occurred during this flight." The words hit her like a gust of cold air. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. There was no turning back now. She swallowed hard and nodded again. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she forced herself to stand. The officers didn't wait. They turned, motioning for her to follow. As Cara stepped out of the cabin, her footsteps echoed in the narrow space of the empty jet bridge. Each one sounded like a final judgment, a countdown to whatever came next. She could feel eyes on her from the shadows of the crew area, people watching but not speaking. Curious, hesitant, maybe even a little afraid. As she passed by Samuel Reed, their eyes met for a brief second. There was sympathy in his gaze, but also helplessness. This was beyond him now, beyond all of them. Cara stepped into the terminal, where the noise of the airport seemed distant and unreal, like the sound was coming from behind a wall of glass. The chill of the air hit her skin, but she barely noticed it. The officers walked on either side of her, silent, professional, impassive. No one said what this was. No one had to. To Cara, it felt like she was walking into her own undoing, step by step, through a terminal full of people who didn't know her and yet somehow already knew enough. Her breath grew shallow as she moved farther into the sterile maze of corridors. Her heart pounded with every step. What was waiting for her? A meeting? A reprimand? Would she be suspended? Would she be fired? Would this make the news? She didn't know. But she did know that everything she had built was now on the edge of collapse. There was no escaping the truth anymore. She had acted on impulse, on assumptions, and she had humiliated someone who had every right to sit where she did. And now, that single moment, a moment that once seemed so small, was about to decide everything. The uncertainty was unbearable. As the officers led Cara Phillips around the final corner of the terminal, she felt like she was walking through a fog of dread. Her eyes darted around nervously, hoping, irrationally, for some kind of interruption, someone to stop them, to tell her this was all a misunderstanding. But no one did. The people they passed didn't glance her way. Just another uniform, another airline worker walking through the airport. They had no idea what this moment meant to her, no idea her entire life was unraveling, one step at a time. To them, she was just another flight attendant, but to Cara, this was the beginning of the end. They stopped outside a small, sterile-looking room near the airport's security checkpoint. One of the officers, barely making eye contact, said simply, "Wait here. Someone will be with you shortly." Cara nodded numbly and stepped inside. The door closed with a soft, ominous click. The silence in the room was immediate and suffocating. The sterile white walls felt like they were shrinking inward. She scanned the space. A single table, 2 chairs, nothing comforting. She sat down, her hands still shaking. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. She couldn't tell anymore. Her thoughts circled the same track over and over again. Evelyn Moore, the boarding pass, the quiet dignity. That calm that never cracked, not even once. Evelyn had known. She had known exactly how much power she held, how deeply connected she was. Cara hadn't seen it, hadn't even thought to look. And that blindness was what had brought her here. She had misjudged Evelyn, not just as a passenger, but as a person, a woman with influence, a woman who wouldn't need to raise her voice to change the course of Cara's life. The door opened. Cara's heart stopped. 2 men in dark suits stepped into the room. They looked every bit as intimidating as she had feared, clean-cut, expressionless, with folders in their hands and judgment in their eyes. They didn't introduce themselves immediately. They didn't need to. They were from Sky Atlantic's legal department. The taller of the 2, a man with graying temples and a voice like cold steel, took a step forward. "Cara Phillips," he said. She stood, her legs shaking. "Yes," she replied, almost too quietly to hear. "We're with the airline's corporate legal team," the man continued. "We've been briefed about the incident on your flight. Mrs. Evelyn Moore has already filed a formal complaint." The words hit her like a hammer. Formal, filed. It was real, more real than ever before. The second man stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the table, far thicker than anything Cara had ever seen for an in-flight issue. The sight of it made her feel like the room was tilting. "You'll need to provide a full explanation," the man said, "why you removed Mrs. Moore from her assigned seat, why you treated her as if she didn't belong. You need to understand, Ms. Phillips, this is a very serious matter." Cara lowered herself into the chair, feeling every word like a weight pressing against her chest. There was no escape now. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She wasn't sure there were words for what she felt. Regret, fear, humiliation, and the slow-burning realization that this mistake might cost her everything. The taller man continued, wasting no time. This situation could result in internal disciplinary action, including suspension or termination. Depending on Mrs. Moore's legal stance, it could also open the door to litigation. Cara swallowed hard. She could barely breathe. "And just so you're fully aware," he added, "Mrs. Moore's husband is not only a majority shareholder, he's on the executive board. You may have placed the entire company's public image in jeopardy." The room grew colder. Cara nodded slowly. "I understand," she whispered. But the words felt empty. She didn't understand. Not fully. All she knew was that everything was slipping through her fingers. The men gathered the file and stood. "We'll be in touch," the first man said. "For now, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation." Then, without another word, they left. The door clicked shut behind them, and Cara was alone again, frozen in place. Her thoughts swirled. Evelyn's expression, the hum of the plane, the glance from the captain, Samuel's look of sympathy, the whispered murmurs of the passengers. Everything she had built was teetering on the edge. Her years of service, her discipline, her reputation, all undone by one choice, one assumption, one moment of unconscious bias. She stared at the wall, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her, her hands still folded in her lap. And she knew, deep down, this wasn't about whether she kept her job. It was about something much bigger. It was about the person she had allowed herself to become. The ticking of the wall clock echoed louder than anything else in the small, sterile room. Cara Phillips sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the second hand as it made its endless sweep, around and around, like her thoughts. The events of the flight played back in her mind, scene by scene. Her decisions, her assumptions, the humiliation she caused. The way Evelyn Moore had simply endured it all, without raising her voice, without retaliating, and yet with a presence so powerful it still lingered in the air. There was no rewinding what had been done, no undoing the harm. Her career, her reputation, her future, all of it now rested in the hands of people behind closed doors. And for the first time in a very long time, Cara felt completely powerless. The door opened softly. Samuel Reed stepped in, his face shadowed by concern. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her as if trying to find the right words, and realizing there were none. Finally, he asked in a quiet voice, "How are you holding up?" Cara didn't respond right away. Her mouth was dry, her voice distant when she finally said, "I don't know if I can fix this." Her eyes were locked on the floor, too heavy with shame to lift. Samuel sighed, not frustrated, but weary. He stepped further into the room and sat across from her, folding his hands in his lap. "Whatever happens next," he said gently, "don't lose yourself in this. You made a mistake, a serious one. But mistakes don't have to define you, not forever." Cara blinked slowly, the ache in her chest tightening. "You'll learn from it," Samuel continued. "You'll grow stronger. But you have to let this be the start of something different, not the end of everything." Cara looked up at him. Her eyes were red, her expression blank, but somewhere deep behind that, a flicker of something stirred. Maybe not hope, but the first breath of it. "I hope you're right," she whispered, her voice barely more than air. Samuel gave her a small, tired nod, then stood. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. As the door closed behind him, the silence returned, heavy and still. Cara sat there, alone again. But this time, something had changed. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would look like, whether she'd be allowed back, whether she'd ever wear that uniform again. But she knew one thing. She would never forget Evelyn Moore, never forget the power of dignity, of silence, of calm in the face of injustice, and she would never forget what it felt like to be on the wrong side of that moment. The clock kept ticking, and Cara sat still, not because she had given up, but because she was finally ready to face whatever came next.